Okay, so I'll be talking about this objective, explain the role of practical wisdom in Aristotle's ethical theory. To talk about the role of practical wisdom in Aristotle, I'll first start with one of the basics of Aristotle's ethical theory, and that is that Aristotle's virtues are on a spectrum. Too much or too little, and the virtue becomes a vice. Too little courage is cowardice. Too much courage is recklessness. Generosity is similarly on a spectrum between stinginess and wastefulness. And where the appropriate location is on a virtue spectrum will vary from situation to situation and from person to person. And the role of practical wisdom is to know where the appropriate location for a given virtue is in a given situation and to move us to act accordingly. But I think, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, but I think explanations that dive into practitioners are especially helpful here. So I think it's more helpful to think in terms of good people and good practitioners acting. And practical wisdom is a descriptive term to answer the question, well, how did they know what to do in this given situation? And how did they know what was needed in that situation? And how did they move and act accordingly? In the last session, I mentioned the father in Les Miserables. And if we read that scene, so it's the scene where Jean Valjean has robbed the father, the church father, and then Jean Valjean is brought back by the police, and the father says, oh no, he didn't steal those. In fact, he forgot the precious candlesticks. Here, let me give those to him also. And if we read that scene through the lens of Aristotle, we could analyze and perhaps determine that the church father deliberated about how generous he should be with Jean Valjean after Jean Valjean stole his silverware. And the church father determined that this was a situation that called for an abundance of generosity bordering on wastefulness. And he acted by giving Jean Valjean his prized candlesticks. So that's one way to read it. But this sort of deliberation, I think if we watch the scene, we don't imagine this church father calculating or deliberating that way. We imagine that this sort of deliberation was developed over years of this church father recognizing and responding to people in need. So this wasn't a random decision and act, uninformed by his past experiences. And this likely wouldn't be the response of someone unaccustomed to working with people in need. Or at least if we look at that scene through the lens of Aristotle, we might conclude that. So this can be our first working model of the role of practical wisdom, knowing and acting on the appropriate location or range of a virtue in a given situation. So now let's look at it through some key terms and passages, and then finally I'll explore another example at the end. So I'm going to start with some key terms to help us get into the role of practical wisdom in Aristotle's ethical theory, and again, in contradistinction to theoretical wisdom, to help us better read Aristotle's teaching about practical wisdom. So the first is just the Greek term that Aristotle used that you maybe heard in some of the videos or you've seen as you've looked into this, is phronesis. So phronesis is the term for practical wisdom. Phronesis is sometimes translated as practical wisdom, sometimes as prudence. And I've just noted several terms that I think can act as good, helpful hooks for this idea, with the hope that as we go through these terms briefly, then read through some passages and talk about an example, we can all have a better sense for what's going on here. And you'll notice some repetition and refinement as we go through these terms and through the passages. So starting with the terms, practical wisdom concerns action. It's not just theoretical knowledge. It answers what ought I to do? And it results in action. So this is has a practical rather than a theoretical conclusion. So an example of a theoretical conclusion could be something like, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, where this is just a conclusion of a line of reasoning. But practical wisdom results in taking an action. Practical wisdom is based on a model of good people with experience. So it's not based on rules. It's not based on people with knowledge only. It's based on people who have experience. And then practical wisdom involves good deliberation about ways to achieve ends. And the conclusion of the deliberation is to take an action. Again, there's our a repetition. And practical wisdom is concerned with human goods versus goods that apply to everything, universal goods, or goods that apply to animals. And practical wisdom concerns particulars and variables. So not universals, not invariables. And virtue supplies the ends for practical wisdom. Virtue helps us know what human good we're aiming for, and practical wisdom provides the means to get there or to move closer to that end. And while practical wisdom is not identical with virtue, they're closely affiliated, and neither is possible without the other. So with these terms in mind, let's now read some passages from Nicomachean Ethics about practical wisdom. So here's the first from book 6, chapter 5. So regarding and I've added the bolds, and these are to, or the bold words, and this is to kind of reference the terms that I've shared already. So regarding practical wisdom, we shall get at the truth by considering who are the persons we credit with it. Now it is thought to be the mark of a man of practical wisdom to be able to deliberate well about what is good and expedient for himself, not in some particular respect, for example, about what sorts of things conduce to health or to strength, but about what sorts of things conduce to the good life in general. Practical wisdom then must be a reasoned and true state of capacity to act with regard to human goods. And then practical wisdom deals with things that are variable. Practical wisdom must also recognize the particulars, for it is practical, and practice is concerned with particulars. This is why some who do not know, and especially those who have experience, are more practical than others who know but don't have experience. For if a man knew that light meats are digestible and wholesome, but did not know which sorts of meat are light, he would not produce health. But the man who knows that chicken is wholesome is more likely to produce health. We love when Aristotle gets into concrete things like chicken and light meats. Practical wisdom is concerned with action. Practical wisdom issues commands, since its end is what ought to be done or not to be done. Practical wisdom is the quality of mind concerned with things just and noble and good for man, but these are the things which it is the mark of a good man to do, and we are none the more able to act for knowing them, just as we are none the better able to act for knowing the things that are healthy and sound. But a man should have practical wisdom not for the sake of knowing moral truths, but for the sake of becoming or being good. The work of man is achieved only in accordance with practical wisdom as well as with moral virtue. For virtue makes us aim at the right mark, and practical wisdom makes us take the right means. It is impossible to be practically wise without being good. Still with me? Sorry, we're going through it, but we're reading Aristotle. So everyone, you can now tell your friends, oh, I've read Aristotle. Okay. All men then seem somehow to divine that this kind of state is virtue, that is, that which is in accordance with practical wisdom. But we must go a little further, for it is not merely the state in accordance with the right rule, but the state that implies the presence of the right rule that is virtue. It is not possible to be good in the strict sense without practical wisdom, nor practically wise without moral virtue. It is plain that the choice will not be right without practical wisdom any more than without virtue, for the one determines the end, and the other makes us do the things that lead to the end. And here's an example. I know I shared examples of other practices earlier in a previous session. And I think it's helpful to examine practical wisdom in terms of a practice, in this case, medical practice. So imagine in an operating room, an experienced doctor with practical wisdom will attend to their patient in ways that promote the patient's health. So if we look at these kind of key terms, for the action, practical wisdom results in the doctor taking certain actions or not. The actions could be to check the patient's pulse or temperature. It could be to remove a tumor. It could be to inject an antibiotic. It could be to insert screws to hold a broken bone together. It could be to re-break a bone. It could be to postpone the operation altogether because of something they noticed. So it results in an action. People, the reference for practical wisdom is the experienced good doctor, not a medical textbook, not any rule, not any abstract guiding theory. And then particular and variable, what the doctor does is contingent and variable. They would take entirely different actions with a different patient or in a different situation. For example, if the room catches on fire, or if they have different tools, or if the patient has other complicating conditions. And then deliberation. Their deliberation involves this particular situation and varies accordingly. Each patient and each operation brings its own set of circumstances that must be attended to. The end of the deliberation is to take a certain action. And then human good, this operation is removed from ultimate concerns like the ultimate good of contemplation for Aristotle. This is for particular human goods, in this case, the healthy patient. And means end, in the role of virtue, the end can be a healthy patient, and practical wisdom informs the doctor what to do to best lead to that. Aristotle talks about practical wisdom in general. Like one of the passages that I read says it's not about a specific situation, but a person with practical wisdom understands what to do in general toward the general good. So he talks about it in general, but I don't think it really helps us to understand it better by extrapolating. Aristotle talks about practical wisdom in general, but I think it helps us better understand it from extrapolating from practices. It's in the practices that we can make sense of what's going on with practical wisdom. It is in practices, specific practices, like a doctor working in an operating room, that can shed light on what practical wisdom looks like in general. But I don't think it works the other way around. It doesn't really help to think about, okay, what is the virtuous person doing in the world, going about their daily lives, and how does that inform what understanding a doctor in the operating room? But I think looking at a doctor in the operating room can shed light on what a good person looks like. So it is as if Aristotle is saying that the good person uses practical wisdom comparable to the good experienced doctor using practical wisdom in the operating room. But the good person uses such practical wisdom in all situations. So that's what I think is helpful, is looking at it in a specific practice. And if you have another practice where you're more familiar, you're more like, okay, I understand what happens when chef is working in a kitchen, or when a tennis player is playing tennis, or when a chess player is playing chess, what's going on? And then move from that to see, okay, how does that inform what a good a person with practical wisdom does on in general? Okay, so that is my sense of the role of practical wisdom in Aristotle's ethical theory.